The sun was setting over Havering, casting long shadows through the grand halls of the palace. King Edward III, a once mighty ruler of England, lay in his bed, his body a mere shell of its former glory. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, and his breath shallow. The room was silent, save for the occasional cough or the distant murmur of attendants. It was hard to believe that this frail, sickly man was the same king who had once led England to glorious victories at Crécy and Poitiers. Edward had always been a strong and decisive ruler, but the last 8 months of his life were a dark and painful descent into illness and political turmoil. His health had deteriorated rapidly, and the kingdom was slipping into chaos. The once revered king was now a shadow of his former self, and the people were growing restless. Alice Purrs, Edward's mistress, was a constant presence at his bedside. She had been his closest companion in recent years, and her presence was both a comfort and a source of scandal. Many in the court resented her influence, but she remained by the king's side, unwavering in her loyalty. One day, as Edward lay in his bed, a commotion erupted outside his chamber. Alice had tried to present a petition to the king, but his chamberlain, Roger Beauchamp, refused to let her in. The noise grew louder, and Edward, despite his weakness, heard her voice. With great effort, he shuffled to the door and opened it. The petition requesting the pardon of Richard Lyons was placed in his hands, and he read it. Despite Beauchamp's protests, Edward granted the pardon, a small act of kindness in his failing state. The kingdom was in disarray. Parliament's will had been flouted, and key figures from the good Parliament were being hunted down. Sir Peter de la Mare was thrown into a dungeon in Nottingham Castle, and William of Wykeham lost all his temporal estates. Even the Earl of March was forced to surrender his marshal's staff. The once great king was now a pawn in the political games of powerful lords like John of Gaunt. On his 64th and final birthday, Edward gave lavish robes to his 7 serving physicians and surgeons. It was a far cry from his 50th birthday, when he had raised his sons to dukedoms and held a grand feast. The jubilee of his 50th year as king was hardly celebrated, and a general pardon was announced. Sermons of the king's new moral purity were preached, but Edward's illness had reduced him to a mere vessel of his sickness. In late January 1377, Edward's health took a turn for the worse. His imposthume, a type of abscess, abated, and he was transported by barge to his palace at Sheen, closer to Windsor. As his boat passed Westminster, the lords who were attending Parliament in the presence of his grandson came out to wave and cheer him. It was a bittersweet moment, a final show of respect for a king who had once been the heart and soul of the realm. Edward managed to attend one last St. George's Day celebration at Windsor. On April 23, 1377, he lifted a sword to dub his 2 10-year-old grandsons, Richard of Bordeaux and Henry of Bolingbroke, into the Order of the Garter. He also knighted his youngest son, Thomas of Woodstock, and several other young heirs. It was a moment of solemnity and tradition, a final act of a king who had seen the best and worst of his reign. Edward was taken back to Sheen to die. Few visited him, and those who did found him placed in his chair like a statue in position, unable to speak. He was swaddled in cloth of gold and muslin, nailed into his throne for the occasion. The image was striking a once great king, now reduced to a lifeless figure, enduring his last duties. John of Gaunt and several bishops were in attendance, and the address to the king was delivered by Robert Ashton, but Edward could not comprehend it. His mind was clouded, and his logic was awry. When he recovered his speech a few days later, he secretly summoned the Londoners. He urged them to make a great candle bearing the coat of arms of his son John, and to carry it in a solemn procession to St. Paul's Cathedral. The Londoners thought he had gone mad, but Alice continued to ply her political dealings, securing the restoration of William of Wykeham's estates. The days passed, and Edward's condition worsened. On June 2nd, he made preparations to commemorate the anniversary of his son's death. On June 4th, he granted his last charter. His younger sons and a few trusted advisors were with him, but then they left him alone in his chamber. Alice remained, along with a few household staff and chamber knights. In his bed, Edward still talked of hunting and hawking, of the joys he had known. But on June 21st, he suddenly lost the power of speech. He had suffered a stroke and lay in his bed, unable to move or speak. Alice was with him, and a priest was called to his side. According to the chronicler Thomas Walsingham, Alice removed the rings from Edward's fingers before she left. Whether true or not, it was a poignant moment. To the king, the rings no longer mattered. He was drifting into the oblivion that had consumed everything he truly loved. As the priest prayed at his side, Edward whispered his final words, "Jesu, have pity." The room was silent and the king was gone. The great hero of Crécy, the once mighty ruler of England, had passed into history, leaving behind a legacy that would be remembered and revered for centuries to come. Edward III was a king who reshaped England and left a lasting impact on the world. Let's dive into the heart of his reign and explore what made him such a remarkable ruler. One of the most significant things Edward did was to redefine what it meant to be a king. When he took the throne at the age of 18, England was in a mess. His father, Edward II, had been deposed and was being held by enemies. Despite this, Edward not only managed to free himself, but also restored his mother's dignity and began an aggressive foreign policy. This was no small feat, especially for someone so young. He showed incredible leadership, not just in battle but also in how he governed. Edward believed that a king should be a leader, a spiritual guide, a patron of the arts, and a champion of chivalry. He combined these roles to create a model of kingship that inspired not just his own people, but also other European monarchs. Edward's reign was marked by peace in England, which was quite unusual for the time. In 1327, he was told that his primary duty was to maintain peace. He did this by keeping wars on foreign soil, which was a smart move. Instead of fighting at home, he focused on battles in France. This strategy not only protected England from the destruction of war, but also allowed the country to prosper. The wool trade, for example, thrived during this period, leading to the construction of many great churches. Without the peace and stability that Edward provided, this prosperity would have been much harder to achieve. Internationally, Edward elevated England's status. When he first became king, England was seen as inferior to France. The French king and the Pope had a strong alliance, which dominated European politics. Edward, however, was determined to change this. He challenged the Pope's authority and strengthened English royal rights. His actions helped England diverge from the Catholic Church and paved the way for a unique national identity. He also proved himself as a capable and respected ruler on the international stage, earning the respect of other nations, from France to Italy. Edward's approach to warfare was revolutionary. Before 1346, battles were fought by heavily armored knights. But Edward changed this by using groups of peasants and yeomen armed with longbows. At the Battle of Crécy, these archers defeated the French knights, showing that military success wasn't just about having the most heavily armored soldiers. Edward's strategy combined projectile warfare with the chevauchée, a tactic that involved a wide front of destruction through enemy territory. This method forced the enemy to attack and made it easier for Edward's well-organized army to win. This strategy was so effective that it was used again by Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Edward also played a significant role in the development of Parliament. While he was firm and decisive in international politics, he was more flexible at home. He allowed the Commons to have a greater voice in government, something that his father would never have permitted. This led to important reforms, such as standardizing weights and measures and the regular sitting of Parliament. Edward's willingness to compromise with his people helped to build a stronger and more participatory government. Edward's personal character was as fascinating as his achievements. As a young man, he was ambitious but also nervous, especially when dealing with the powerful Roger Mortimer. He was a quick learner and had a deep love for adventure and challenges. He had a strong sense of fairness and was known for his mercy, even though he could be harsh to his enemies. His clemency often went beyond what was expected, sometimes to the point of being too lenient. For example, he forgave Geoffrey Mortimer and Archbishop Stratford, and he showed mercy to many others who had committed serious crimes. Edward's legacy is vast and varied. From the grand palaces he built to the laws he enacted, his influence is still felt today. The flag of St. George, which is still used in international sports, is a direct result of Edward's vision of England as a warrior nation. His model of kingship, his methods of warfare, and his approach to governance all contributed to shaping England into a powerful and respected nation. In his personal life, Edward was a man of strong convictions and a deep sense of duty. He was a romantic at heart, always drawn to the adventures and challenges of kingship. His straightforward and logical approach, combined with his sense of fairness and mercy, made him a king who was both feared and loved by his people. Edward III was more than just a king. He was a visionary who left a lasting impact on the world. Edward III was a king who stood at the crossroads of loyalty and contradiction. He was a man who forgave his former servants, like John Mullins, for past crimes, showing a deep sense of mercy and loyalty. This trait was not just a passing fancy, it defined his reign. Edward remained steadfast to those who had stood by him during his darkest hours, especially those who helped him overthrow Mortimer in 1330. His loyalty extended to his country and his faith, with a particular devotion to St. George, St. Thomas the Martyr, and the Virgin Mary. Yet Edward's character is not without its complexities. He was accused of encouraging a licentious court, with tales of adultery and immoral behavior. Despite these rumors, there is little evidence of him fathering illegitimate children before his wife, Queen Philippa, fell seriously ill. His only confirmed infidelity was with Alice Pers, which began when Philippa was already gravely ill and making arrangements for her death. Edward's relationship with Alice, while controversial, showed another side of his loyalty. He remained faithful to her even after Philippa's passing. Edward's contradictions are what make him a fascinating figure. He was a man of deep faith who sometimes clashed with the church, a straightforward ruler who could be devious when necessary, and a fair king who could be brutal in war. He destroyed French villages and took lives, yet he showed mercy to defeated enemies. These contradictions reveal a man who was far from perfect, but whose strengths and weaknesses shaped the course of his reign. One of Edward's most admirable qualities was his courage. In an age where the safety of leaders was not guaranteed, Edward risked his life on the battlefield. He fought as a common knight in tournaments, and stood on the front lines in battles like Halidon Hill. His bravery inspired his men to fight with the same determination, leading to significant victories in the early stages of the 100 Years' War. Edward's willingness to lead from the front, to fight alongside his soldiers, and to put himself in harm's way set him apart as a leader. As we look back on Edward's life, it's clear that his legacy extends far beyond his reign. His virtues and flaws have become part of the English people's heritage. Whether through direct lineage or the cultural impact of his reign, Edward's influence is felt in every corner of English society. He may not have been a perfect king, but his ambition, courage, and loyalty left an indelible mark on the nation. Edward III helped shape the England we know today, for better or for worse. His story is a reminder that even the most complex and flawed individuals can leave a lasting legacy.